Welcome back everyone to another video about just medieval history. Today the region I'm covering is a very vast one. In Inner Asia. I was originally going to cover Inner Asia, but it's just too large a region, so I'll divide it into two parts. Eastern Inner Asia and Western Inner Asia. What is Inner Asia exactly though? I'm going to define it as like the Central Asia plus the more or less populous regions of China, like Tibet, Xinjiang, Qinghai, and Mongolia, as well as outer Mongolia. That's going to be what I call Inner Asia. It's a very historically has been a very dynamic region, and the birth ground for many nomadic empires that eventually conquered large parts of the exterior and greatly influenced medieval Eurasian and to some degree African history. Yeah, so who were those people then? Oh, they were mostly Turkic and Mongols. And today, although they're not very populous, there are a lot of Turkic countries out there, as well as well, only one Mongol one. But as you can tell, these countries were probably a lot more important in the past, and that's what I want to cover today, especially in the eastern part of Inner Asia, which I will also define as basically all of China except China proper and Mongolia. So yeah, I'm going to be discussing those regions today, starting from AD 600 or 8550. Yeah, let's say 8550, because that was when the Göktürk Khaganate started conquering most of this region, well, at least up to Xinjiang, Mongolia, probably Manchuria, and also Western Inner Asia. Yeah, it was a very large empire, but the land didn't seem very populous, of course, but it was populous not in humans but horses, and that's what really mattered in ancient times or in medieval times. You probably know by now, but horses were extremely important to warfare and economics. If a country had a lot of horses, it could get things done fast, it could transport stuff fast and supply its army quickly. It would help with logistics, and cavalry, very important too. So horses were sort of like the oil of the medieval world. Everyone wanted them. Everyone would fight wars to get them, and use the horses to fight even more wars to get even more horses. I think that's how the cycle worked. At least that's what I guess. But where did most of those wars take place then? And one of the main hotspots was Eastern Inner Asia. And the Göktürk Khaganate conquered most of that land. Yeah, you can think of the Göktürk Khaganate as like the Roman Empire or the Mongol Empire of the Turks. Not only was it very expansive, but it also have a profound legacy among Turks today, spreading Turkic influence west and southwards from the original homeland in the Altai Mountains between Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Russia, and China. yeah, for the most part, the Goktur Khaganate, like most Central Asian Khanates, were not sedentary. They were nomadic, but they did have a few important cities, like Tardu and Ishbara, which gradually became more and more important within the Goktur Khaganate and split the empire in two. So now there was a Eastern Goktur Khaganate ruling most of Xinjiang in Mongolia, and then there was a Western Goktur Khaganate, which ruled, yeah, everything west of that, of course. The Eastern one and the Western one wouldn't last because basically divide and conquer. That's what the Chinese did. China had been divided itself, but recently unified around AD 600. And then the Tang Dynasty came to power and gave rise to possibly one of the greatest periods of Chinese expansion in its history. They utterly defeated the Gokturk Khaganate, and I'm not sure about the population figures, but it was said that the Chinese defeated the Gokturk Khaganate outnumbered 10-1, which is very hard to believe considering China had a larger population than the Gokturk Khaganate, and also they had less horses. But I don't know, just take that with a grain of salt. Chinese historical accounts might not be the most accurate. Well, most historical accounts are biased towards the accounts, but anyways, if you choose to believe that, then let's just say the Chinese defeated the Gokturks 10-1 and dismantled most of their empire. Then the Chinese armies marched on the Western Gokturk Empire and subdued that too. So immediately after the Gokturk Empire was divided, it was Inner Asia became a patchwork of Chinese colonies and protectorates. And yeah, the Chinese played the art of war to the greatest. They would, split tribes whenever necessary, or encourage tribal confederacies to form and ally against with their enemies. And sometimes they would also, launch coups in all those protectorates and colonies whenever possible. They did this in sort of a way was like I like to describe it as a great game between China and two other major powers that arose after AD 600, and that was the Tibetans and the Uyghurs. So after China conquered the Eastern Gokturk Khaganate, their influence north of Xinjiang, which was known as the Protector General to pacify the West, or Anxi, it didn't last very long northwards of there, and so the second Gokturk Khaganate arose, reviving Gokturk power briefly, but it was soon replaced by the Uyghur Khaganate in Mongolia. The Uyghurs formed a pretty centralized empire. It didn't have many vassals because it annexed most of its vassals, and it also started invading Chinese Xinjiang and fought many wars there. Around the same time, the Tibetan Empire was forming and contested China hotly with the Eastern Inner Asia because of the Silk Route. So not only was Inner Asia important because of the horse abundance, but also because of the Silk Road, and that was what made China a very, very rich empire, and would soon make Tibet rich as well once they conquered the cities of the Tarim Basin previously ruled by China. China later regained those lands in the late 7th century, but after the Anlushan rebellion and a defeat by the expanding Arab Caliphate at the Battle of Talas River, China's influence there would never be the same. The Battle of Talas River, by the way, it wasn't that important if you already know about it, because the Chinese only lost Kyrgyzstan after that battle, and before that the Chinese had already defeated the Arabs multiple times, including at the Battle of Aksu. People only like to talk about the Battle of Talas River because they just think it's a very interesting battle between civilizations, like between the Islamic world and China. But there were also other players as well, the Tibetans who allied with the Arabs, and the Karliks who originally sided with the Chinese but then defected from them to join the Arabs and Tibetans. And afterwards the paper also spread from China to the Islamic world and later to Europe. But in terms of immediate geopolitical terms, it wasn't that important. The main reason why China lost control of the Silk routes to the Tibetans was not the Battle of Talas River, but the An Lushan Rebellion, which killed roughly a third of China's rebellion. What am I saying? Okay, roughly a third of China's population within like 20 years, making it one of the deadliest civil wars in history, if not the deadliest. And the Tibetans and Uyghurs took advantage of that. The Tibetans even occupied the Chinese capital at one point. And then afterwards, the Chinese were forced to lose all of Xinjiang, the Tiran Basin, as well as Gansu, to the Tibetans. So Tibet was now the strongest power in Eastern Inner Asia. And by the way, Tibet in medieval times was actually a lot more of a habitable place than now. Like, researchers suggest the Tibetan plateau had a population 10 or 3 times larger than now, like around 10 million, which is pretty high for medieval times. But yeah, mostly likely as a result of just being climate patterns, I guess. The Uyghurs too consolidated their gains from the Silk Road after China was ravaged by the An Lushan Rebellion. But both Tibet and the Uyghur Khaganate would not enjoy their gains for any long-term period of time, because by the time of the early 9th century, China had recovered, although it could not regain its lands. The Tibetan and Uyghur Khaganate later collapsed, and I'm not sure why. And it's even stranger because they collapsed like at the exact same time. So suddenly Eastern Eurasia, or Eastern Inner Asia, went from being ruled by 2 medieval superpowers to being this nightmarish patchwork of tribal nomadic states. What were those tribal nomadic states? Well, in Tibet, we had multiple kingdoms that briefly turned away from Buddhism. I'll try to name all of them, but I might be naming some Buddhist sects instead, because region and sect was very intertwined during this period in Tibet. So here goes. You have the Kingdom of Gugay, Ladakh, which isn't really Tibetan, but whatever. It ruled Western Tibet. Then you have Sakya, Maryol, Nyingma, Amdo, Kagyo, I think, and maybe Lhasa. That's all I can remember right now. Yeah, definitely a lot more tribal states that I forgot. But from the early 9th century to the time of the Mongol invasions, Tibet was in the era of fragmentation, as it was known. Buddhism later revived there in the 10th to 11th centuries, and then it spread from Tibet to other parts of Eastern Inner Asia, but not yet, because the Uyghur Khaganate was a Manichaeist state, and they adopted a different form of Buddhism, not Tibetan, after the Manichaean Uyghur Khaganate collapsed. Instead, there was Islam spread there first, and then another sect of Buddhism arrived in Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs live now. They were driven south by the Kyrgyz from the Yenisei region. So that new Khaganate that dominated Mongolia was known as the Yenisei Kyrgyz. So you can sort of see the Yenisei Kyrgyz Khaganate as the successor to the Uyghur Khaganate. However, the Yenisei Kyrgyz Khaganate was a lot decentralized than the Uyghur Khaganate. I'm not sure why, but basically around this time, Mongolian states and khanates started forming. They gained independence from the Uyghurs and were technically still independent when the Yenisei Kyrgyz came in the 9th century, because they were only vassals to the Kyrgyz. So it's very interesting in my opinion, because both the Uyghurs, who you think of as being native to Xinjiang, and the Kyrgyz, who you think of as being native to Kyrgyzstan, they both came actually from Mongolia, or the lands north of Mongolia, the Yenisei region, and somewhere in Mongolia is where the Yenisei Kyrgyz and the Uyghurs came from. Later they migrated there. Well, later the Kyrgyz migrated to Kyrgyzstan during the Mongol invasions, I think, and the Uyghurs migrated to southern Xinjiang, also known as the Turan Basin, after the Kyrgyz expelled them. So it's sort of an exodus of Uyghurs to southern Xinjiang. Sorry. And there they formed two kingdoms. The Koto Uyghur Kingdom, which had a lot of names like Koto, Idikut, Tarim, and Koja are all names for this kingdom. In any case, it was the westernmost Uyghur kingdom. It, I think, was Buddhist, and it had a very unique society, because there were no poor people there, if the sources I used were correct. Anyone who was poor would just be given necessary resources by their neighbors until they weren't poor again. So cool little fact there. There was a sort of similar mentality in Tibet, I believe, but it wasn't as socialist. Not saying the Kojo Uyghur Kingdom was socialist, but it definitely has some resemblances. The other Uyghur state was the Gansu Uyghur Kingdom, which ruled parts of the Eastern Turan Basin, I think, and Gansu, which it is named after, as well as southern Xinjiang. Southern Qinghai. The Gansu Uyghur Kingdom only lasted for a century before it existed after the Chinese regained that land and established the Guiyi Circuit in the mid-9th century. But once China collapsed again during the late 9th century, The Gui circuit was left on its own and had to coexist with the Gansu Uyghur kingdom until a century later, the Tanguts from Tibet arrived. The Tanguts established a sort of Chinese, sort of the Tibetan, sort of Uyghur dynasty there, known as the Xia or Western Xia. It can also just be called the Tangut Empire, which I will use. But yeah, it was heavily influenced by China because it adopted a Chinese dynastic name. But I think was Buddhist for the most part. Tibetan Buddhist, probably. The Xia vied for power with the newly formed Song Dynasty of China until around the 11th century, or what is it? Sorry, I'm getting these centuries off like a lot. Okay, early 12th century, when the Jurchens kicked out their Liao oppressors and yeah, conquered most of North China from the Song, which I don't know how I will get over this. Alright, that wasn't that hard. I'm not gonna lie. Okay. As I was saying, yeah. So basically, the Tangut Empire no longer had a border with Song China. Instead, it bordered Jin China, the Jurchen-led dynasty of China, which, yeah, the Jin did call their state China, even though it was led by Jurchens. And I think I should delve deeper into that region where the Jurchens lived, actually. Today we call it Manchuria, which is a part of North China. But in the past, it was not just run by Manchus, also known as Jurchens. There were also other tribes like the Mongols and most importantly the Khitans, which I will spell Khitans. The Khitans, at some point in the mid 10th century, they fought a series of wars with the Yenisei Kyrgyz and their Mongol vassals, which I think they won, and so their influence in Mongolia was greatly spread. The core territories of the Khitan Empire, which later adopted the dynastic Chinese name of Liao, was I think Western Manchuria and also parts of North China. They were the dynasty that I think occupied Beijing. Like the Song Chinese never actually controlled Beijing, or what the city that is now Beijing. It was during the 10th to 13th centuries. It was the Khitan Liao that controlled Beijing, as well as most of Mongolia. Again, technically they didn't rule Mongolia because it was a series of vassal khanates ruled by several Mongol and Turkic tribes. So I'm just gonna name a few. There's the Kamag Mongol, considered the predecessor to the Mongol Empire, and it's where Genghis Khan was born. There's the Southern Mongol Khanate in Inner Mongolia. There's the Naiman Khanate. I think that one's either Turkic or Mongol. I'm not sure. There's the Buryat. Again, not sure if that's Turkic or Mongol. Oh yeah, there's the Kyrgyz. I think they're Turkic, and they're interesting because they were both Buddhist, and I think Eastern Nestorian Christian. So yeah, you had a Christian state somehow in the middle of Asia, while most of the for most of the medieval period, Christianity was limited to parts of Africa and Europe. So yeah, that's why I think Genghis Khan treated Nestorians quite well. But anyhow, the other Mongol states includes the states that ruled Mongolia include the Tatar Confederation and the Zubu. The Tatar Confederation is the namesake of modern Tatarstan and the word Tartary. Tartary is the word that is described, and I'm not sure where it first popped up, probably during medieval times, but it was a word used to explain most of Inner Asia. And yeah, it's not a complete exonym from Europe, because there literally was a Tatar Confederation in the middle of Inner Asia. But oh yeah, so similarly, there's another word name for this region of Inner Asia known as the Heartland. If you don't know about the Heartland hypothesis, it basically says whoever controls the Heartland or Inner Asia would control the rimlands, basically China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. And whoever controls the rimlands would control the world ocean, and therefore the world, or something like that. I mean world island, not world ocean. But yeah, the logic is that controlling these lands allows you to control other lands, which allows you to control the world. Not sure if that's agreeable, but it does have some validity, because yeah, the Mongols, Turks, and many other nomadic invaders like the Huns all originated in the Heartland, and they dominated most of Eurasia and to some extent Africa for a very, very long period of time. So, not saying it's entirely true of the Heartland hypothesis, but it does make some sense in the medieval world. Anyways, oh yeah, especially when horses were so important in the medieval world. Okay, so as I was saying, all those Mongol states I listed were vassals to the Khitan Liao, until, you know, the Jin destroyed the Khitan Empire. The Khitans were left with a small enclave in their original homeland, and yeah, it was a vassal to the Jurchens. Oh yeah, another kingdom I forgot to mention, which was east of the Khitan Empire and disappeared by the time of the Jin Empire, was the Balhae. Like a bunch of these nomadic empires, I don't know the true ethnicity, but people say it might be Tunguis, Turkic, Chinese, or I think Korean. It's probably Korean, but I'm not entirely sure. So please excuse me. But it did rule most of North Korea and Eastern Manchuria for some time until the Liao, I think, defeated it, and then the Jin came and united the Jurchens to defeat the Liao. What else was I gonna mention? Oh, yeah, there were also a bunch of tribes north of Mongolia and Manchuria, like the Orochen and the Dar, that didn't really have their own states, but were vassals to either the Jin or the Liao, or later the Mongols. But anyways, after the Jin destroyed the Khitan Empire and reduced their homeland to a small part of Manchuria, other Khitans, not content with that, fled west, not towards Mongolia, not towards Xinjiang, but all the way to Bukhara in Uzbekistan, to the borders of Persia. So yeah, that's a very, very long distance. But the Khitans managed it and established a new homeland for their weakened empire. And yeah, I think Transoxiana, or they didn't actually rule Transoxiana directly. Instead, they managed their new empire through vassalizing the Kyrgyz, and also they vassalized the Kocho Uyghur kingdom by this time as well. So yeah, it's very bizarre because you have an empire that literally moved, and even more so because it was still recognized as a Chinese dynasty. So you'd have technically a resurgence of Chinese power in Central Asia, right to the borders of Persia, which at that time was ruled by the Seljuks. Actually, sorry, the Seljuks really weren't Persian, they're Turkic, but they ruled most of Persia and lost a battle in Central Asia to the Khitans at the Battle of Katwan, which was seen as a major victory against Islam, not just by the Buddhist Khitans, but also by Christian Europe. And it sort of signaled the beginning of the end of the Seljuk Muslim Turkic Empire, because, you know, they were defeated multiple times in their eastern flank against the Buddhist Khitans, and also in the western flank against Christian Crusaders. Alright, anyways, back to Eastern Inner Asia. I sort of delved into Western Inner Asia by talking about that. Yeah, there's probably a bunch of states I forgot to mention. Like well, the Yenisei Kyrgyz still existed, and they had a bunch of Buryat vassals, you know. So there's the Kamek Kipchak Confederation, and a bunch of states in Qinghai, more states in Manchuria that I don't really know the names of, but I know they exist. Anyways, it doesn't matter, because by the time of the 13th century, all of Eastern Inner Asia, and I mean like all of it, not a single territory missing, was ruled either directly or indirectly by the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan, and also his successors, of course. So I hope I really don't need to delve deep into that, but yeah, basically some Mongol ruler united, ruler of Kamag Mongol united most of the Mongol states, and then first he defeated, I think, the Xixia, and then subjugated the Jin, but not before turning all of Karakitai and Iran into part of his empire. Then after that, his successors marched all the way to Europe, almost broke through the Holy Roman Empire, then went back east, elected a new Khan whose heirs would later conquer the rest of China under the Southern Song dynasty. Yeah, it was a pretty crazy time period. The Mongol invasions also ruined much of the Muslim world, or at least for a temporary period. But for the most part, the Mongols left. Well, not for the most part, but some. Okay, you see some states in Eastern Inner Asia were left under indirect rule, and the ones that weren't were basically wiped out. Like the Tanguts were completely genocided out of existence. The Khitans, as well. Lots of depopulation happened under the Mongol Empire. Like genocide occurred left and right during that time period. Half of the Chinese population was killed, and And yeah, basically that was what happened to territories under direct Mongol rule. However, the ones that weren't really subjugated to these atrocities were the Kocho Uyghur Kingdom, and most of Tibet. Like, Tibet was still a patchwork of kingdoms, but they remained relatively independent of Mongol rule, even when the Yuan dynasty was established. And yeah, I think that's where the video will stop for now, because I've went on for 35 minutes, and I think that's too much. Okay. Yeah, goodbye.